wow, they made 11 series out of this. Like what?
You know, Seinfeld, as you know, he really has a lot of clout, so he can pull anyone he wants into his show, and so it's like a
Oh, they
very
made
simple
11
premise.
series?
Yeah, so it's a very simple premise, right? And he can just anyway. So I think that's awesome. But we're live, by the way. I'm going to
Okay.
move this so that the holes in the wall don't show. But that's from my sister. Previously, she occupied this room for a short period of time, and she stuck up this TV, which she then subsequently took down again. But I'm very pleased to welcome once again for the second time to our special podcast, the Holistic Life and Wellness podcast, Natalia McMahon. Am I pronouncing your surname right?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Well, I'm asking you.
By me, yes, it's right. But I remember actually totally off topic, but well, it's very much on topic, but unrelated to the podcast. I remember I was a temp for a recruitment agency before, and I had went in to get my pay slip, which was paid on a weekly basis. And the receptionist was like, "So what's your name?" And I told her, and she went, "Yeah, I can't find your name here." And I was like, "Well, it's definitely there. I worked this week, so it's definitely there. Check again, please." So she checked again. "Yeah, no, I still can't find it. Can you repeat your surname for me?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay." So I repeated it, and she's like, "Yeah, no, it's not here. What's your address?" And I went, "Okay." So I told her my address. She was like, "Yeah, no, it's not here." And I was starting to get a bit annoyed at this point. So this recruitment consultant had come over who I worked with, and she had said, "Is everything okay?" And I explained to her, and she had a check, and she was able to find it. And I thought, because the receptionist had actually said to me, "Are you sure it's not McMahon?" And I was like,
Oh,
"It's no, I'm
oh,
definitely sure. I've had this name for like a long time now, and I'm sure it's not McMahon." Um, so she just kind of like made a point of saying that she couldn't find it. So yes, so it depends on who you ask. But by me, it's McMahon. Some people say McMacken. Some people say McMahon. Americans say McMahon.
McMahon. McMahon. Okay, so Natalia McMahon is here with us, and we're going to talk. Um, the title that Natalia very kindly came up with is Connections in Life and Death. You were mentioning to me recently, Natalia, about how you sort of you just came up with a eulogy for your still living grandmother.
Yeah,
And can you say a little bit about that?
yeah. So, well, she's 83, and obviously, as time passes in a person's life, um, you kind of become a bit more aware of the the fact that it could end at any time, especially if someone doesn't have good health. And especially with pandemic situation, it's all a bit quite uncertain. And I had thought, so she is unwell at the moment anyway, my grandmother's unwell, and I had started to kind of think about, like, well, what happens if, and oh my goodness, as your mind does, especially at like 3 a.m., which is when this was. And so it was like, oh, what'll happen if something happens to her? And, what would I say if I was asked to speak about her? And then I started to kind of think about memories and stories that, because this is the thing. People say there's like multiple versions of you or anyone in life, you know, um, because there's the you that you're aware of and that and then there's all the versions of you that other people meet in life. Also, not just depending upon how they perceive you, but also the stages of growth that you're at during those different periods. So, I started to think about what were they, what memories really kind of, what memories do I have of her? And then I started to kind of put these things into, I suppose, an order in my mind, as to how I would speak of her if she, when the time comes that she passes on. And then I kind of thought, isn't it really weird that the idea and concept of a eulogy is so strange, because we say a lot about a person when we're honoring them in death. We say so much more whenever we're honoring them in death than we do in life. And I wondered, excuse me, I wondered why that was. What obstacles do we have in the present that prevent us from being emotionally open and vulnerable with people that we love? And why, whenever they pass on, is it is it easier to kind of acknowledge those aspects of them, their importance to you and things like that? And one of the things that it occurred to me to kind of note in any kind of eulogy for my grandmother was that she, and by extension my mother, and her sisters and me, all the women in the family, were all very much like this to a degree. We're not very emotionally expressive, and that is something we've obviously picked up from my grandmother along the way, because she can be quite not emotionally detached, not even emotionally distanced, but emotionally awkward. And she can kind of, you would never hear her say that she loved you. And I mean, some people think this is terrible, but for me, it's the norm. This is what we grew up with. But by the same token, whilst it's not something that's said very often, it's something that we know that goes without being said. And I think that kind of factors into the fact that obviously, they say only like 20% of our communication is actually verbal, and the other 80% is body language and non-verbal. So, you can, without it being said, you already know, so and you see that, people talk about different love languages, for example, and how a person expresses their love. And this is something that's kind of, across the board.
Can you remind us what the 5 different love languages, right? Do you remember them off the top of your head?
I don't actually know, but I kind of was thinking more of my own kind of relationship, and how, more from a family kind of setting. So like my granny, for example, she's a massive feeder.
Mm.
She feeds you, like, just, you have to eat. You go to her house and it's just like massive meals that you have to kind of climb over. It's like
Yeah.
man versus food, but Belfast style. And
So just to remind us, so that may be, well, so these are the 5 love languages, right? Words of affirmation, quality touch, physical touch, acts of service, and receiving gifts. So what would you say your grand's love language in that case would be? So it's almost like receiving gifts, or acts of service, quality time, all of those things somehow, right, come under that.
true, but
Yeah.
the acts, the gift giving, that's a bit of a problematic one, I think.
Because
What is that? Like, how do you define that? You
yeah,
know? And then there's the material aspect of that. Do you really need someone to give you something in order to know how they feel about you?
there are people like that though, right? There are people who
Oh,
they
100%. My mother is a massive gift giver. Like, she is like, she, with it coming up to Christmas time, she still kind of carries on. I'm 36 and she's still like, so what do you want Santa to get you? And I'm like, I'm 36 now. I'm Santa, I've taken over the Santa reins. And she's, still kind of goes out of her way to buy lots of things. That's how she kind of expresses her, I suppose that's her love language, but at the same time, from a consumerism perspective and things like that, that's kind of, I would wonder why that would be listed in love languages as a love language, and where that kind of originated from, because there is that I suppose it depends on what you define a gift to be. Like my kids come in from school and they've made me a picture, that's a gift. They've written me a card, that's a gift. If they go outside and they, pick me a flower or something along those lines, or leaves or whatever it may be, that's a gift. You don't always have to buy a gift to give a gift, I suppose, is the moral of that. But yeah, my granny would be more feeding, looking after you, tending to you, caring for you, those types of caregiver expressions of love. But by the same token, it's kind of interesting in that, you kind of, probably in infancy, I would say, we come to kind of understand from an unspoken perspective how someone communicates their love. And then you kind of adapt to that, particularly in family settings. So.
To that point, I mean, something that I relatively recently realized. So I, come from a South Asian background, and South Asians stereotypically are notoriously bad at expressing love, through words. Like, people don't say I love you, and very little kind of touching and hugging and things like that. And but I recently, the penny dropped. I don't know why it was a relatively recent thing, or where what the inspiration was for my realizing this. But South Asians are big on food, so it's like, the way they express love is by feeding, and they say, they'll ask you, have you eaten, and eat more, and they'll like load your plate full of food and keep like wanting to feed you. So and as someone who's mix culturally, come from a South Asian background ethnically, but lived most of my life in the West, so I'm very used to the sort of norms that have been put forward by a lot of Western narratives, especially through Hollywood and stuff like that, about love being something if you love someone, you tell them 100 times a day or something. I don't know. So it can be tough sometimes, making, as a South Asian, born to South Asian parents, to accept that this is just not it's just not part of their vocabulary, almost. And added to that is the fact that also it just happens to be the case that my parents, my father, my late father, but also my mother, are or were, in the case of my father, just not very capable anyway at expressing love, probably because that's how, to your point, how we're socialized in our family contexts and culturally and things like that. So probably because they themselves really didn't receive words of affirmation in that regard. In my father's case, he really, grew up in very tough circumstances. So for them, there wasn't really probably that wasn't even a question. It was like survival. They're in survival mode, right? So maybe, and this is just totally a stray idea, maybe some of the ideals that I've come to expect to be ideals, maybe those ideals are in the best of, like, if everything else is taken care of, then we can talk about some of the more nuanced and subtler type. Again, I'm like thinking about this as I'm talking. So just occurred to me, maybe one of the reasons why in South Asian culture it's about food, because historically, as a result of colonialism, things like that, like food wasn't always so readily available, and a lot of these people, a lot of my, in the case of my parents, but also other South Asians moving to the West, they were economic migrants, right? So for them, it was just a question of survival. So when it gets to more subtler versions of love, as it were, like poetry, for example, right, is very subtle, as it were. Not to say that Bangladeshis don't have poetry. Historically, that's where my parents come from, Bangladesh. But Bangladeshis have been, some phenomenal poets coming out of there. But Poetry and that type of love language maybe is a little rarefied, right? Maybe when everything else is taken care of, we can start thinking about, more rarefied versions of expressions of love. Who knows? I don't know.
It's interesting that you kind of mentioned survival mode, and then obviously food scarcity as well, so food becomes a commodity of types. And if it goes back to, I suppose, what we were saying there about gift giving. So people generally give things, well, if you take nowadays, for example, gift giving is big business, so there's that expenditure element, and there's a lot presently about the cost of gifts, and as if that equates something to their worth. But at the same time, if you were living in a food scarcity society or situation, that's also quite a large expenditure, so it's quite a big gift in its own way. And I think from a survival mode perspective as well, it's quite interesting because obviously my grandmother, she was born in 1938, so she grew up like during the Troubles in the north of Ireland. So it was a very uncertain situation, and there was a lot of scarcity about a lot of different things. There was economic uncertainty, and there was instability in terms of just the state itself, your rights as a person, your ability to even access proper housing, so there was a whole lot, even voting rights, so there was an awful lot of things that were uncertain during that time. And I think, that's why I think what you said there about that survival mode, if you're focused on all these other things, you don't have the time, the luxury, or the capacity to really necessarily focus on, some of the big issues that kind of get discussed today, like the positive affirmations, and improving your children's self-esteem, and even how, so that trickles down into everything that you do, even in the family unit. It trickles down into your outlook, your mentality, and how you are as a parent, how the family unit runs, things like that, especially whenever it comes to large families and things like that. So I think that's a really important point. And I think that's why, there's a lot of criticisms sometimes from certain quarters nowadays about how people parent, and oh, you're making your children kind of too soft, and bring back discipline, and this, that, and the other. But if we looked at it more from a parental growth and evolutionary perspective, a lot of us, obviously some people aren't as fortunate, but a lot of us live in different circumstances than the previous generations before us. And that gives us the freedom and the luxury then to try and evolve our parenting, and try and bring the focus on other things rather than just the necessities and the basics, And I think that's a good thing to do. But I think people don't really often dig into the reasons why, and understand then its point and purpose, and the benefits that go with it. So they just kind of think you're making kids soft and there's no consequences and things like this, but that's not necessarily the case. It's just your parental approach is changing with the times, which is to be expected.
Right. And in keeping with everything that you just said, and this is a reminder to myself more than anything else, is to, through recognizing the conditions from which, say, my parents came, my father had a different set of circumstances from my mother, but nevertheless, my mother, for example, she is one of 10 children, right? So very different circumstances. My father was one of 5, but again, he had very, very, very tough upbringing, as he lost his father at the age of 10. So to to have that awareness, as a child of my parents, to be more compassionate towards them, and to not have always too many expectations of them. That they maybe they did the best that they could given the tools that they had, the intellectual, emotional tools, because we are, so much of who we are today obviously is as a result of our upbringing and the conditions through which we came, right? So and this is just a reminder to myself, but also in keeping with everything that you said, maybe there is an evolutionary process, right? I mean, given that my circumstances are different from my parents' circumstances, maybe I should then, when it comes to future generations, bring that wherewithal to the table in taking care of future generations going forward. But could you tell me a little more about the eulogy?
Well, sorry, I actually just wanted to go back to another point that you made there.
Yeah.
And I think this is important as well, because if we're going to talk about that emotional awkwardness, or in some cases emotional detachment from a parental perspective, particularly with previous generations, a big issue was infant mortality rate, so especially and that's why you had large families often, so you could understand, particularly from a mother-child perspective, that and this was how it was with my great-grandmother, for example. She had some miscarriages, and she had lost some babies, and some small children, and that will have had a profound effect upon her. But also, at the same time, you didn't have the same understanding or awareness of things like depression, or you didn't have the same, there wasn't the same focus on mental health and well-being back then as there was now. And again, that also ties into that scarcity mentality and a different generational thing.
Exactly. I was just going to say, in my parents' case, I'm pretty, almost 100% sure they didn't even have that kind of language. And for many years, God bless my mother, I remember her saying, because I struggled with depression in particular as a teenager. And I remember her even saying in so many words that there's no such thing as depression, which is really weird to process, if and accept, if it's a very real reality in your case. But also maybe not to go on and on about this, but in keeping with everything that you've been saying, some things we've been discussing thus far, that maybe when one is in survival mode, like if someone is literally worrying about whether they can put food on the table, or whether their child, the newborn, or children in plural, whether they're going to survive into double-digit figures age-wise, maybe it's something much more deep. Maybe it's not even depression in that case. Maybe it's like existential. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like maybe people don't even have time to be depressed in those circumstances. Who knows?
Yeah. No, I don't think, my previous generations I know people in previous generations who would say, oh, you just get on with it, because there was nothing else. There was no other option.
Right. It's almost as if, again, I'm not at all trying to downplay the severity of people's mental health issues, as someone, not least of all, who's struggled with a lot of these things over the years myself in the past. At the same time, I can't help but wonder if some of these issues are as a result of things being a little too comfortable for us sometimes, right? Like if people are literally having to work in the fields, I mean, to say in the Bangladeshi context, my parents never had to work in the fields, but being very physical, like very physically active. I mean, I know for a fact, and this is something I tell my clients all the time, and it seems like a little too simplistic almost when it comes to mental health struggles sometimes, like get up and move around, like do something physical. That really goes a long way towards easing a lot of mental angst that we have. I'm not saying that it's only that these things, that depression doesn't exist, but you see what I'm saying.
No, but yeah, I mean, I do see what you're saying, because I mean, it's none of this is to kind of minimize or downplay any. We're talking about it in a particular context, for example, and that context is, you know, a number of generations ago, and how people dealt with these things then versus what we know and how we deal with things now. But back then, you know, yeah, you did have to get on with it. You had no choice but to get on with it, you know. At the same time, though, you know, like my grandfather, for example, he struggled really a lot with his mental health and was in and out of hospital different times, and, you know, had different types of treatments and things like that, and was quite reclusive for a period of time, you know. So his response was much different than like my granny's response to, you know, or I think, and perhaps that's a male female difference as well, you know. um from a female perspective, particularly, you know, at that time, traditionally speaking, the role of the mother was to kind of keep the family functioning and going, and the role of the father was to provide. So, and that's kind of interesting when you look at it from a modern perspective, you know. So the mother has no choice. She has to live for, like, particularly in this set of circumstances, she would have had no choice. She would have had to continue on for those that were dependent upon her, you know. The father had one responsibility, really, which was to provide and work and provide for the family, financially speaking. But now we're all kind of doing that role. And there's been a bit of a, there's blurred lines between the gender roles in the home. And you know, obviously I'm just kind of like thinking off the top of my head here, but it occurs to me, I wonder if that the stresses that we have from work, right? So if we look at like how my granny would have dealt with things versus how my granddad dealt with things, obviously you've got two different people. So you've got two different sets of experiences, and you've obviously got their own kind of different ways in which to deal with things. But my granny would have been kind of much more stronger in how she would be anyway, but she would have been more stronger in how she dealt with things rather than how my granddad dealt with things. His kind of it was a different, it was entirely different. So I wonder if, because he didn't have those other kinds of concerns per se, you know, where he wasn't tending to the children as such, he wasn't getting up in the morning, wasn't getting them fed, wasn't getting them dressed and washed and out the door to school and doing school pickups. There's none of this kind of like wider kind of like, these people depend upon me, you know. They're not, certainly not from a direct connection viewpoint. You know, there's that distance already established. I go to work, I earn the money, but I'm separate from my family. Do you see what I'm saying? So there's that separation there, and there's those boundaries between those different aspects of your life. Whereas the woman didn't really have those boundaries between the different aspects of her life. It was all just one big thing. So, you know, now that we're all going to work, as I said, now that we've all got an aspect of those boundaries, for the most part, I understand some people don't work. I think the aspects of joy that you get from looking after other people and the motivation that you get from having to show up for others, that accountability aspect, if they're absent, or if they're not something that are as prominent factors in your life as they once were, you've lost a bit of your drive there. You've lost a bit of your motivating, you know, aspects. And there's that distance. You become more, particularly like, for obviously I'm a mother, I work, I study, I look after my kids, I work part-time. But I think for modern women, and I don't mean to rattle anyone up the wrong way when I say this, but I think for modern women, I don't know. I don't know if that separation between roles, where you go out, that compartmentalization of I'm an employee now, and this is me here, and this is me now, and then I go back home, and then I become this different role. I wonder if that is a contributing factor to stress. Because there's a double life element there. There's
Of course.
the aspect of trying to juggle many balls at the same time, taking
I,
on various roles.
I was just going to say, for a number of years now have been in awe of what many women are capable or are doing. This incredible juggling that you're describing. I honestly don't know how women do this, how you guys do this. It's not easy. I mean, to have you have a part-time job, some cases women have full-time jobs and they're homemakers at the same time and they look after their children, and I'm not sure to what extent the division of labor, as it were, between the two partners, male and female in this case, are so equitable all the time. It's
Yeah, well,
I
that,
think
that is I mean, there's been newspaper articles, for example, and particularly during the pandemic, it was noticed that women were doing so much more than men, because they're trying to work from home, they're trying to still do their role at home. And I think that working from home aspect, I mean, it's great. It gives you that flexibility. It's very good for childcare, and it's great to be in your own environment and things like that. It's good for your mind from that perspective. But it also has its negatives, because there is that issue of work-life balance. And whilst compartmentalizing everything in your life can be a stress, there are also boundaries within that. It offers you boundaries. You have cutoff points, right? Okay, so I'm finishing work at 5. That's me done. I'm no longer work Natalia. I go home and I'm mummy Natalia. And although not that my kids call me mummy Natalia, because that would be weird. But you know what I mean? So there's the things are a lot more blurred. You're kind of juggling things, especially whenever you were doing homeschooling, for example, which was just what? How do you even do that,
how was the adjustment like? Because I know it really hit so many parents hard, or maybe most parents, when that homeschooling thing all of a sudden was thrust on them.
I have to say, I was very fortunate because I was still I was a key worker, so I was still working during the pandemic. So, and I was working out of the house, like I actually went to an office. So not much changed for me apart from the frequency of my hours, which had increased. So a lot of, I mean, if you ask my partner what he thought of homeschooling, and if you ask the kids what they thought of homeschooling, it's probably going to be a lot different than what I'm going to tell you homeschooling was. I get the, yeah, went well, our homework's all done, but I'm sure somewhere in that time period there was tears, there was,
So as far as you were concerned, that transition was very easy. It was completely painless.
for me, it was
Yeah.
just I took on the traditional role of the man and I went to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah,
I didn't
interesting.
worry about it. you
So
know.
interesting. Yeah, because the lines are not only blurry now as far as what the roles are, the traditional kind of roles are being flipped over and sort of turned on their head and things like that. So how does that affect, do you think, male female dynamics, sort of sexual dynamics, not just sexual dynamics, like
How do you think that affects dynamics? Let's go straight to sexual I mean, what?
Well, I mean, I think sex plays a big part in all of this, right? I mean, in intimate relations, it's said, right? I think there's a degree of truth to this that, um, if an intimate relationship is healthy, then usually sexual
No,
life is quite
that's true.
healthy, right?
Yeah, any kind of issues with intimacy is going to be because of something else. I mean, that's most people know that, but then no one talks about the elephant in the room, and then the issue with intimacy just persists, because
Right.
people aren't actually having that honest conversation. And I suppose that actually brings us back full circle to where we began with, why can't you have these honest conversations, people? Why wait until a eulogy to tell people how much you cared about them? By the same token, why do you not then why do you not have open communication with someone whenever there's a problem? And I suppose there's a lot to kind of consider about that. You worry about how the other person's going to receive it. Perhaps you don't like conflict. Maybe you're embarrassed. Maybe there's a bit of, emotional awkwardness within yourself. That is obviously, if this is something, if you're emotionally awkward about speaking to somebody else, it could be that you've learned that behavior yourself through your own life experiences. And then there's the other aspect of when distance starts, and this is also related to intimate relationships too. Distance is um it's it never it's gradual, you know and it's something that increases. The rift increases with time, and the longer it goes unaddressed, the larger an issue it becomes. And this is something to be said for not just personal relationships like between spouses or whatever, but also for any kind of family relationship dynamics. If the more that you don't talk about something, the bigger that rift grows between the people involved. And then, I've actually seen, I'll give you a kind of an example without actually going into too much detail, but I know of a family, and a number of the sisters within the family in particular stopped speaking to each other. And when they were each asked individually, why are you not speaking to each other? No one knew the answer. No one knew. Each person gave a different, account of when the incident, the root cause kind of happened. But it didn't make sense because
Wow.
when that was kind of discussed, whenever, when I said, like, that doesn't really seem like a big deal though, why did you stop talking about that? Oh, I don't know,
Wow.
so it was something that they couldn't even tell you when it began. In fact, to give you a better example, one of the people involved said it goes right back to childhood.
Oh.
And I was like, well, if it goes back to childhood, why is it rearing its head
Excuse me. Yeah.
whenever, you're in your 50s? This is childhood stuff. What happened throughout those 40 years that it didn't matter, and all of a sudden it matters? Now you're in your 50s.
Wow.
What was the childhood stuff? Oh, I don't know. So each person couldn't actually say. But that's like between like 3 or 4 siblings, and they could not say what the root issue was. But
And these
what it
three or
meant
four
was
siblings, none of them talk to each other.
no.
Wow. And haven't done in how long did you say?
Possibly 18 months, 2 years,
Wow. Yeah.
something along those lines. And yet nobody can really kind of shed any light on what it started with. Very strange. But it goes to show you how when you don't address something, it grows and it develops. And then by the end of it, you don't even know what you're arguing. Well, not arguing, but you don't even know why there's that distance. You no longer remember the root cause. but it's caused such a rift within the family, or between friends, or indeed between couples.
Mm.
But we have this aversion to open communication, and I'm not sure why exactly that is.
Because maybe partly because open communication is not easy. It requires being honest, not only to the people we're communicating with, but maybe it also entails very quickly being honest with ourselves about ourselves, right? And opening ourselves up to potential critique, right? The maybe I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head here, but maybe it's also partly because in the short term, it's easier to avoid the confrontation, right? It's like we're very, from a very basic psychological point of view, we like to avoid pain, right? And we go towards pleasure, very simplistically put. But if in the short term, confronting an issue means sort of experiencing some pain, then we're just going to avoid it. But of course, in the longer term, that pain only compounds. But it gets more and more difficult with time. And also, I think our schooling doesn't prepare us at all. Like the modern educational system is junk, it's shit, it's rubbish. I mean, and I say this as someone, I was saying to someone recently that I'm like too educated at this point. Like I have too many degrees. And so, I have all these degrees, and I can honestly say that the modern educational system does not prepare us for healthful living in ourselves or sort of interpersonally. It just doesn't equip us. I mean, the modern educational system, historically goes back to the creation of good workers, basically, right? Originally sort of factory workers, and now, whatever. So, I mean, there all
Yeah, I
these...
would be inclined to agree. And interestingly, more and more teachers are actually beginning to acknowledge that they are not, through their training, appropriately equipped to deal with, or to even acknowledge, or to be aware of, to have awareness of mental health and emotional kind of difficulties. And they are becoming, like, I know a number of teachers, vice principals, school teachers, primary school level, that are actually pursuing counselling qualifications outside of their job, and they're going out and they're actively trying to better and increase their knowledge of emotional health and well-being for this purpose, so that they can better understand kids. Because they're like, I listened to one girl talk recently, and she said, she was at a counselling course, and everybody had to introduce themselves and kind of give an idea of why they were there and what brought them to it, why they were interested in the subject. And she said, I'm a primary school teacher, and I'm here because I'm becoming more aware of the fact that the children in my class, their behavior has a backstory, and I don't know how to understand the backstory, and I need to learn how to understand that backstory so that I can understand why they're behaving the way they're behaving in class.
Well, this teacher is amazing. I mean, God bless her that she's taking time out of her, no doubt busy schedule, if she's already a primary school teacher, to equip us. But, I imagine she's unusual in this regard, right? I mean, this is amazing that she's doing this, whether she's unusual or not. The fact that she's having to make extra time out of her already busy schedule to equip herself so that she can equip herself so she can deal
at her own expense as well.
At her own expense as well, right? I mean, again, this is very, very sad, and it really worries me a lot that where we're all heading, right? And I mean, some of these issues that children are presenting, and adults, all too often now, it seems there's a lot of research coming out about this, but not enough. It's not, I don't think it's coming out rapidly enough, and there isn't a wide enough awareness of these things. It's due to our being online. Like just by virtue of being online, this affects us psychologically adversely. We know this as far as children's sense of self-esteem, and especially amongst girls, but not only. Instagram is having devastating effects on people's sense of self worth and things like that. So
Well, interestingly, actually, I was speaking to a pastoral care officer within the school setting, primary school level, recently, and she was saying that they are doing a lot of focus on within the school, among particularly on relationships between female children, between young girls, because there is so much, and this was frightening. They're doing this friendship building because apparently there's so much like competition between girls, and there's bullying and unkindness and things like this here. But basically they're having to teach young children, young girls, how to have friendships, because they've identified it as an issue. And I thought, my goodness, so you're doing this like girl specific kind of focused program of work. Why is this such an issue amongst young girls? So I spoke about it with a vice principal that I know, and the teacher that I referred to a few minutes ago there when I was telling you, the one who's went to start the counselling course, and they were saying it is exactly, they think it's based, or it's due to that kind of those social media platforms, where and the Insta life, for example, TikToks,
right. So to interrupt, we know that these technologies really have deleterious effects as far as our basic social skills, right? People, I mean, I know sort of, what's the word? I mean, I've heard stories, from individuals that, they were scared of going back to work, in person, because they were anxious about it, because they're so used to doing things online and not having to interact with people face to face. And these were adults, who are worried, let alone children, who, I mean, I've heard also stories of from parents who, for whom it was a worry that their children were going back to school because they didn't know how they're going to cope. But it was almost as if that they had to be re-socialized, anew. So
I think there's a lot of anxiety around that, like pandemic situations, because obviously there is that people have become slightly reclusive, as you say. That idea of staying within your bubble and only socializing with your bubble, that was promoted for like the first part of the pandemic, for example, mainly in like the first wave and the second wave. That it's had I think it's had a massive impact on bonds, not just from a wider social perspective in terms of like friends and colleagues and things like that, but also in terms of families and wider family networks. And I know, that's kind of impacted upon support as well, which ties in with your questions about what was it like to kind of do homeschooling, and what was it like for you to work from home, and for, what was it like for the family without that added additional wider family help and support. It's really hard. They say it takes a village to raise a child, and it is very much true. But our biggest problem is that we don't have the villages anymore. There's this push for people to become a lot more distant with each other. And
the village has become social media again, right? Which is a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. Like the worst kind of, and I'm no Luddite by any stretch of the imagination, but the worst human tendencies are put forward on social media as being like the things we should aspire to be like. And especially when it comes to young, impressionable children. There's this, I was watching something recently, I think just yesterday. I can't remember this person's name, L- Lovato, maybe some personality. Apparently, she was a child Disney star. Now she's like, making music and acting and
Yeah.
things like
Now
that.
she's a they.
Yeah,
Yeah. Now it's Demi Lovato, I think you mean.
Demi Lovato. Yes, yes.
Lovato is now they, is their
Oh,
chosen.
yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. Right. Sorry,
Yeah.
Demi Lovato is now they, who is encouraging children, and the person who was sort of talking about her critically, a woman, was saying that this person, Demi Lovato, most likely has a lot of young children listening to them, and most likely girls, who and she Demi Lovato, this gets very hard to talk, but they're basically saying it just does, frankly speaking, and I'm not normally bad at talking.
So many words, man. Let me do that simply.
um, but this character, they are basically encouraging young children to go out and have lots of sex and make porn and masturbate and all this stuff. I'm not even joking. Literally, this was their tweet. Like, so what kind of influence is someone like Demi Lovato having on our children's?
I have to say, my 5-year-old loves Demi Lovato, and
Oh, really?
she loves this particular song, "Sorry Not Sorry," that Demi Lovato did,
I
and she loves
see.
it. It's her favorite song because there's a swear word in it. So she's like, "This is my
What's the
opportunity."
swear word?
She drops the F bomb.
And
My 5-year-old
it
sings
wasn't
along with
censored. Wait,
absolute.
it wasn't censored. How did that happen?
Oh, it's on YouTube. It's on my YouTube. So like, I'm
Ah,
36. I'm over 18. I'm allowed to listen to this stuff.
wait, interesting. So this Demi Lovato, whose fan base is usually young children, is dropping the F bomb in one of their songs.
Yeah, but I think um I would say I'd be shocked if Demi Lovato's fan base or even like target audience is intended to be small children. I think perhaps whenever Demi Lovato was with Disney and that whole outfit and scene, that was probably likely then. But then you know how it is with these kind of child pop stars. They grow, they develop, and as they do, their audience kind of age changes a little, or certainly their target audience changes a little, and probably more teens, early 20s, I would say. Certainly judging by some of Demi Lovato's recent music. But yeah, my 5-year-old loves that song because it means then she can say the F word. And yeah, and I'm a very relaxed person when it comes to this stuff. I'm like, you can say it with me, but don't say it anywhere else. Okay. I'm not going to shout at you for it. And it's in a song, so it's okay. And I listen to rap music and I'm not going to judge, but don't do it anywhere else. Don't go into school and start being all like, I'm sorry, not sorry, and F you and whatever else, whatever the lyrics may be. Um,
So
but
interesting. I just found the this tweet. No, it was an Instagram image, whatever. But so this is the quote, right? So this is Demi Lovato speaking, writing. Be a slut, show your body, get naked, have all the safe, different consensual sex you want. Be kinky, masturbate, make/watch porn, make money. Make money. Interesting. Just a reminder that being sexual is okay. I mean,
I
they.
think I think Demi Lovato has plagiarized this.
Oh, interesting. From
I
whom?
think this is from actually this is it sounds like an extract from something else. There was an
Oh,
advert that was circulating some time ago, maybe last year. And Cynthia, oh flip me, what's her name? That girl from Sex and the City with the reddish kind of hair. Cynthia Nixon. She did this really, it was actually a really good ad. I liked it. But it was all about like a feminist kind of approach. And it kind of sounds very similar to that. Let me just see if I can find it. So if that's the case, then Demi Lovato has lifted and asked,
well, then
yeah,
that's doubly bad. That's
be a
doubly
lady,
bad.
be a lady is what it was.
Oh.
but it sounds like it's either an extract of that or a play on that.
Interesting. So how do you feel about this quote, whether she originally came up with it or stole it? How do you feel about, former Disney star Demi Lovato telling followers to be a slut and make porn? How do you feel about that? So this was from September of this year.
Tell me again what you said.
Sorry?
Tell me again what you said.
Sure. So what they said.
Sorry, apologies. They.
Be a slut, show your body, get naked, have all the safe, different, consensual sex you want. Be kinky, masturbate, make/watch porn, make money. Just a reminder that being sexual is okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Demi Lovato hasn't directly quoted that particular piece, Be a Lady, that I was telling you about, but it's definitely a play along the same lines.
As someone whom your 5-year-old listens to, I mean, does that worry you? I know your 5-year-old doesn't access Instagram yet, but
yeah, she's only going to listen to the song, and that's okay. But in terms of the message, it's not a message I necessarily agree with. And I actually think it's a strange message to put forward. If you no longer identify as female, if you no longer identify as her or she, why are you putting forward any message on women? If you're now they and them, why are you telling young girls how to be? You see what I'm saying? It's a bit of a contradiction. And, it sounds like it's kind of very like modern, liberal, feminist perspective. But at the same time, it's coming from someone who doesn't identify as a woman. So if a man turned right and said that to me, I'd be like, dude, are you having a laugh? Like, there's no conflict of interest here.
Right.
Like, you want me to do this stuff for some other reason?
I mean, the commentator whose YouTube video I was watching yesterday, who was talking about Demi Lovato sort of critically, she felt or feels that Demi Lovato is a bit of an opportunist. She's just they. My God, it's getting complicated. Demi Lovato, they are just kind of jumping on the bandwagon a little bit. Who knows?
Well, I think Demi Lovato, they needs to stop telling women what to do and let women decide what they want to do themselves, and also leave young girls alone. I mean, if my 9-year-old child was like, "Oh, mommy, Demi Lovato said let's do X, Y, Z," no, it's just a no. Because that there's something wrong, and it's something that we're not really talking about, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, which is the hijacking of the feminist movement. Feminism is never about, let's all take our clothes off and do weird shit. That was never the goal. The goal was, I want to vote. I want to have equal employment rights. I want to have the same kind of pay for doing the same work. I want to have the freedom to work. I want to have the opportunity to work. I want to have the same opportunities. How many guys do you know are out there putting on different tweets to each other about be like a slut and whatever else? It doesn't happen. At what point did feminism kind of become derailed from the actual original movement? When did it become this thing where it's like, at what point did taking your clothes off become an aspect of it? I don't understand that. It was about social, economic equality, and it has veered so far off course. It's become something else. But this often happens, particularly with movements that are within the left. There is a hijacking that takes place, and it becomes something else, and it becomes farcical almost to a point, so things go too far left and it just becomes silly, and that's whenever, it's the same with anything. It's all part of the same scale. If you go too far to the right, it's nuts. You go too far to the left, it's also nuts. There's got to be some sort of balance in there. So that's my thoughts on it. Demi Lovato there.
Yeah. Wow. So tell me a little more about your eulogy for your grandmother.
Oh yeah, because we're way off track now.
No,
I'm
this is perfect. This is
my
amazing.
grandmother.
We're not off track at all. This is
I'm
perfect.
definitely not going to eulogize that my grandmother should have acted like a slut. Should have took pills and this, that, and the other. That's definitely not
She
going
was really great. She just didn't sound
to.
loud enough.
So it's not going to be part of it. Although I'm sure she would appreciate that, because actually I was in her today, and she my aunt had said to the kids, my two daughters, you two girls are going to be such tall girls whenever you grow up. And my granny's head nearly spun off her shoulders, and she was like, did you just tell them you two are going to be tall girls when you're older? And she was like, no, I said tall girls. And she said, my hearing's gone.
Oh my God. Tell me about humor. We were talking before we went live about the importance of humor. Just reminded me.
Yeah, and this kind of factors into what we're talking about living in uncertain previous generations, living in times of uncertainty, or just high poverty, things like that. Humor was something that was used as a form of resilience, I suppose you would say. Particularly from I was talking about this recently, actually. So I think people have different senses of humor even within like a small geographical area, and that's shaped mainly on their upbringing in terms of their experiences, and the quality of life that they had. And I think that when people have less, they find more in life to be joyful about. It's like simple things, it's the simple things now. So
That's beautiful. Yeah.
There's more to kind of in fact, I think what it is that you need to find something that is fun. You need to find something that's joyful. You need to find something that is humorous. If you don't, you just get sucked into the direness of a situation.
Well, here's a kind of a poor analogy, but I think it may serve its function for now. Growing up, I mean, so I lived between the ages of 8 and 17 in Bangladesh, and very really grateful for those years in Bangladesh. Very different Bangladesh then to what is now, but basically kids would go outside and play, and it was like a lot of fun, a lot of climbing trees and jumping around and playing football and all sorts of really fun, active stuff. I was never bored as a child. This I can say with absolute certainty. And one need not have lived in Bangladesh in those years to also people growing up here, in decades past, they've also said, they had a lot of fun growing up. But now kids are all trapped indoors, not always, but very often are indoors doing so, and they're bored. Yeah. Like they complain all the time about being bored, and they have all these toys around them. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is, when I was growing up, first of all, boredom, speaking of depression earlier, like boredom was really not a concept I ever had.
Oh yeah, my granny's like, you're bored? Only poor people say they're bored, That's how she kind of deals with it.
Only poor people.
Boring.
Oh, only boring people. Absolutely. So maybe to your point about humor, like if our creative faculties are, if they're forced to work outside of the box, then we seek out, just as we find fun things in the simple things, maybe we seek out humor in life, because that's just part of who we are as human beings. And maybe if we're constantly being bombarded with too much culture, there was an article in The Guardian recently that came across, where the author was arguing that we have too much culture now. It's like, you know, show after show after show. It's like no time to breathe, no time to think for ourselves, no time to be actually bored as well. Actually, it turns out, speaking of boredom and, you know, whether people in the past, but apparently it turns out boredom is a vital aspect of the creative process, because it's when we become bored that we start to think creative and think, okay, how can I change the situation? How can I invent stuff and all sorts of things? So maybe humor falls under that within that rubric somehow.
Yeah, definitely what you're saying there about the importance of this kind of like your mind being bored, is and how important that is to creativity is it's acknowledged, like it's a recognized thing, you know. There's literature about it. But I think, you know, I think this ties in a lot to overall children's well-being, emotional health and well-being, in that if we're not outside enough, if we're not doing enough things, like I'll give you another example. There's apparently an article recently written, I'd seen it online, and it was I thought, wow, what's this? It's about the like healing properties, I suppose you'd say, of playing with dirt. So how important that is to your immune system. My youngest daughter has a mud kitchen out the back, which she rarely plays with because she is a home bird, and she would sit in all day if you let her. She would just vegetate in the settee and do nothing. She loves that all day long. But so it's a chore to get her out of the house. But
which one is this one? This is the older one?
The youngest.
Oh, the youngest. Oh, the youngest. Sorry, yeah.
She's the one who, if she could, she would climb back into the womb. It's ridiculous. Really is. She's just like wants to sit beside you all the time.
Oh.
So, but you need to exercise them. You know, they're kind of like, if you have a dog, for example, you have a dog. Yeah. So the dog has, you know, it needs stimulation. It needs to get out. It needs to smell new things. It needs to be new places. It needs to see new things. It needs to, you know, just needs to be out there. It needs to be out there a couple of times a day. It's exactly the same with kids. You got to walk kids. I mean, it sounds mad, you know, like, and I'll say, I need to walk my kids. But like 2 weeks, I need to walk them. By the same token, I have this great book about the behavior, Wisdom of Wolves, I believe it's called. And it talks about the dynamics within a wolf pack and the importance of like different roles and different behaviors and things like that. And my daughter, my eldest, had said to me recently, Mommy, do you remember that time I burned my finger on a set of straighteners? She'd been given this like children's version of straighteners, right? Which I had told her not to use because they're really warm, but she didn't listen and she wanted to do it anyway. And I said, no, honestly, I'm telling you, don't be doing it. But no, she didn't listen. She continued on. And lo and behold, she burnt her finger and it hurt like hell. And she said to me the other day, you know, like, why? This was yesterday. Why did you you didn't really seem to care that much, Mommy. Like, why? And I was like, well, let me tell you a story about the how a young wolf is taught within the pack. A young wolf is not prevented from going off and doing its own thing and making its own mistakes and learning from those mistakes. You know, it's given that kind of permission and freedom to do that, and then it comes back to the pack again. Now, there's not an awful lot of discipline that goes with that either, because you know the elders of the pack understand that that's the way it has to be done. So they give the juvenile wolf, the adolescent wolf, time to go and do their own kind of learning, even if something's really silly. So I was telling her this, and I said, you know, it's exactly the same with kids. You need to kind of, you need sometimes in life, not all the time, but there are some cases when you need to learn from what was a mistake. You know, it's the same, not just for children, but for adults as well. There's a period of growth that comes from that. You know, and so anyway, she wasn't impressed with my analogy, and she She said I talk too much about wolves, but there you go. Their behavior is very interesting. So, and sometimes you can compare it to how we behave as humans. I mean, like it's really interesting because they take care of the elders in the pack as well, so like everybody's looked after. They welcome if a female wolf leaves the pack, goes off, has a child with somebody else, and takes that a child as a cub with somebody else, another wolf in another pack. It's welcome back as well, There's a lot of
they're
rich
incredibly social creatures. Yeah, I mean the kind of oftentimes the wolf kind of symbolically is seen as this creature that just goes out by itself, but they're very much pack animals, aren't they? Very
absolutely.
majestic creatures, very intelligent.
But that ties into your point about like being outdoors, outdoor play, outdoor creativity, things like that. A lot of parents now wrap their kids up in cotton wool. They're like,
so dangerous, very dangerous, actually. Yeah,
things are dangerous. I understand.
No. Doing that is actually dangerous. Like being overly protective of one's child is actually setting them up for failure.
No, it is. But at the same time, I also understand how the society has changed and how there's dangers there too. But at the same time, we've got to strike a balance. It
has to be. We have to. It turns out like there's a lot of research that's come out over the years about, for example, the vital role played by rough and tumble play. Too many plays in there, but rough and tumble play helps us to become very socially cognizant. Like we learn, as some young children through this rough and tumble play, what the boundaries are, how far we can go, how far we can push ourselves, but also in this sort of rough and tumble play, which turns out, typically fathers, archetypally, but it's also, I think, true, they engage with their children so the children are learning how much they can take, how much they can push, and kids who've engaged in sufficient rough and tumble play, it turns out, are more socially grounded, right? And kids who haven't actually had rough and tumble play, they can oftentimes be very socially awkward and not so well socialized. So to your point about excessive mollycoddling, right? It's literally, I think it's dangerous, for as far as the child's future is concerned, as being well adjusted.
Yeah, it certainly has that potential. And you're just setting your child up to be codependent for the rest of their lives. You're not equipping them. So if we look at it from a therapeutic viewpoint, you go to see a therapist, you're not to be led by the hand. That's not the goal. It's not the point. The point and purpose of you going to therapy is to gain the tools and the techniques and the knowledge that equips you to deal with things in your life thereafter. It's not to set somebody up in a position until retirement. You're not to become their money train. That's not the point. And if that's what it's turned into, if that's what your therapeutic relationship has become, then you got to get out of that, because it's not what it's intended to be. And it's actually, it's a form of financial abuse at that point, realistically speaking. You're not someone's gravy train. And by the same token, when it comes to kids and parents, you have a job, and it's up to a certain point. It's a very similar process in terms of the therapeutic relationship and the mother-child relationship. Obviously, the mother-child relationship, or the parent-child relationship, should I say, has subtle differences, but the goals are the same. It's about equipping. It's about preparation. It's about transferring skills and knowledge, and it's about support. And a lot of people, if you're wrapping your kids in cotton wool and you're not letting them kind of go out and make their own experiences and learn from those experiences, you're not equipping them. No. You're creating a codependent relationship there.
Very true. This is completely off topic, but I just noticed but I'm sure we can bring it back somehow. So someone posed a question totally unrelated, but obviously this is a guy asking a question. The question is trad girl question mark. So the question is, are you a traditional trad, like, traditional, are you a traditionalist?
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
I think as I become older, I realize I'm much more complex than I ever really give myself credit for.
Mm,
So in a lot of ways,
mm,
God, I'm so not traditionalist. Like I don't
mm,
do the cooking in my house.
mm.
I am messy. I'm untidy. I literally wing life. That's literally how I do things. There is a joke that I am like the dude in the relationship. Everybody says this. My own
Interesting.
father says this.
Interesting.
I don't know. Maybe it's an age thing. I'm 36, so perimenopause, on the horizon potentially. So drop of estrogen, uh, imbalance then with testosterone. And then obviously I'm 40-year-old partner, so his hormones have went awry as well, or certainly are going to. So perhaps there is a hormonal imbalance there between the two, and I've taken on the dude role and doing so. you
so,
know,
so in so many words, definitely not, as far as you
uh,
can tell, trad.
so I mean,
But
it would depend on how I suppose the person who commented would define traditional.
yeah, and what does that even mean? So I think some of I don't know how much of the conversation they've followed thus far, but if they sort of joined us when we're talking about Lovato, maybe some of the perspectives we're putting forward
It could
from
also been, for example, when we
could be read as traditionalist, but
generational
mm,
traditionalist
mm,
roles. But
mm.
again, that there's a particular context to that discussion.
and
So
for people's clarity as well, I mean, because I know you a little bit at this point, you're not conservative. Like you would not
oh
politically consider yourself conservative at all. So quite you're complex. You're very complex. I mean, just as
a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
yeah,
And
and
that's the way
which I think makes more sense as far as how we. I mean, I think that's more honest, right? It's an honest it's an honest way to be, to say that I'm neither conservative nor am I liberal, because it's maybe taking the good wherever we find it, right?
exactly, it's exactly that. And it's kind of funny as well because like I don't know, whenever I think of traditionalism, I have visions of me in a little apron in the kitchen making, bread from scratch, all this kind of stuff. Like that's never gonna happen. Like I can't bake for a start. I don't do food shopping. Um, I don't cook the food. It's very interesting actually. My paternal grandparents are very much like that as well. So my grandfather does all the cooking. My grandmother just watches QVC and buys everything she wants. And that's how she lives. But there are things that she takes on that are traditional. So she does like the housework and things like that. And there is that kind of, I think it comes back to that kind of discussion we had earlier about the the blurring of the lines between the gender roles within the house.
Mm.
It's funny because there's been times whenever I've went out the back to cut the grass in summer and my partner's like, why are you cutting the grass? It's my job. Like, and I'm like, what is this, like me man, me make fire? Like, what's going on here? I'm pretty capable of cutting the grass.
Yeah.
But that's my job. It's almost like, you're encroaching on my small part of my territory that it's just singularly mine. Relax. There's plenty more that I can get you to do.
If you're so eager to do stuff, here's a whole laundry list of
Oh
stuff.
yeah, where to start? I mean,
So interesting. So before I kind of took you off topic a little bit, but I think it somehow all relates, right? If we take it back to the question of connections, right? If we take it back to the
that's all. Can you give me 1 second? I need to put a
if
lamp on. Otherwise,
yeah,
I
yeah,
am going to become a traditionalist sitting here in candlelight at this point.
okay, sure. Well, as you do that, if we talk about the question of connections, I mean, the title that you very kindly came up with, and I thought it was and is a very powerful title, Connections in Life and Death. So how we relate to one another, as people of whether of the same gender, in the example that you were mentioning earlier about girls in schools nowadays having to be taught consciously, actively by teachers and mentors how to play. So how we interact, within the gender, but also across genders. How easy is it nowadays? How difficult is it nowadays? The lines are blurry. I mean, speaking as a man, speaking, not to speak for men, but having worked with a number of men over the years as holistic life and wellness coach, I know that there is a real issue that men feel very often these days as to what their role is. Like, what does it mean to be a man? Is it okay to talk about masculinity? Is the very notion of masculinity ipso facto like almost
Well,
like
I'm
a
actually
word?
I'm glad you're raising this, because when you referred there to what we discussed earlier, which was, the interpersonal relationships between young
Mm.
girls, it occurred to me that is how just how much the concept of patriarchy has become embedded right down to small children. Like, that's how far that has filtered down, where girls can't even relate to each other because of, some concepts that have been introduced by this really warped and twisted um, idealism, I suppose you could say, or ideology. And by the same token, when it comes to men expressing emotions, patriarchy is responsible for, in my opinion, responsible for the issues surrounding that. This idea that boys don't cry and crap like this. Even when it comes to what you wear and the colors that you wear, your clothing that you wear, a lot of this idea that like young baby boys get dressed in blue, for example, from a Western cultural perspective, wasn't introduced until like after World War II. These are all, and I was watching a comedy show the other night. You'd suggested that I watch Joe Rogan, so I gave him a go. He was all right. So anyway, he was talking about like how
You're not converted yet. You're not a raving Joe Rogan fan yet.
I just kind of thought, oh, you're one of these really like loud American guys, and it's like, oh, can we
You
do
should
with
you should
that?
you should watch. You should check out his podcast. He's a very different person in his podcast. And I want you to finish the story, but I'll very quickly say, oh no, finish the story, then I'll mention a little
Okay,
more
so
in relation to Joe Rogan, in relation to masculinity.
basically, he was just talking, not necessarily about masculinity, but what he'd said was how recent our history is. Like, he was talking about like how like when we talk about like historical things, it's so recent. And it's the same when it comes to things like, the ideology of patriarchy. It's so recent, but my God, it took flight. I mean, that train left the station at high speed, and it's in everything now. And right down to young girls wondering, how to communicate with each other, seeing each other as rivals, competitors. It's a bit frightening, the scale and level that it has really kind of taken off, and the impact that it's had on both genders, because it's on men too. Um,
Yeah,
the problem is when you establish a set of privileges. This is the thing with any kind of system that embodies inequality between groups of people. When you afford privileges to one section of society, whatever it may be it the color of their skin, or in this case, gender, or whatever it may be, once you afford them privileges, they feel like they're bought into the concept, because they're all right now. They don't want to be, they're no longer, it's not going to be them, they don't need to worry about that. They're on side, but they're not. this stuff affects them as well, but they just don't see it because they're blinded by the privilege that goes with it. They think that privilege is enough. They don't see the damage that it does. And I see that with locally from a North of Ireland perspective. Whenever you look at, and obviously by the same token, any kind of white supremacist type settler type mentalities, anytime they're in a position of power and privilege, they're happy with their lot. They will not rock that boat because they're doing okay. The minute things shift, be that demographically or just in terms of all those scarcities come back that we talked about earlier on, all those uncertainties come back about food and money and housing and this, that, and the other, then they get afraid. But if everybody united and there was none of this us versus them, or I'm, you know what, I'm not doing great, but I'm a wee bit better than you guys, so I'm all right, I'm not going to rock the boat. If that was done away with and people realized actually we're all getting dealt a shit hand here.
I think this is very important.
You know,
this is very important. So on the question of Joe Rogan, if I may say, mention very quickly, he has literally the biggest show in the world, not just podcast. He literally has the biggest show in the world, the Joe Rogan podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, I think it's called, which has like 1 billion downloads a year. You know, I'm a bit of a Joe Rogan fan, but and right, so
like he was all right, but I'll not rush to watch him again. And here he is.
No, but check out his podcast. His podcast is something very different because in the podcast, he just brings on all sorts of, very, very interesting people, comedians sometimes like himself, but, academics of all sorts of, from all sorts of backgrounds. And he has very, very serious discussions on his show. But I mean, what I really wanted to mention in relation to Joe Rogan and the question of masculinity. So Joe Rogan is a very, very masculine guy, and people who know him very well, they'll often comment that, he's like an alpha male, but like a good alpha male. He's also very well known amongst his friends, and I've been following him for a number of years now, and this is kind of universally, the message that comes out from his friends vis-a-vis him, that he's deeply compassionate, deeply caring, like he just really wants everyone to live together in harmony, and it's like not just chat, because when someone does podcasts over such a long period of time, and sometimes these conversations, his longest conversation is like 4 hours, like he just does these all the time, you really get a pretty decent sense about a person, right? It's hard to kind of maintain a facade for so long. Deeply compassionate guy, at the same time someone who really emphasizes the importance of, for men, again, to get into their bodies, like to do traditionally male stuff, right? We're biologically, men and women, generally speaking, are kind of different. Like you guys, women can have children, we can't have children, right? We can typically, like on the graph, right, there are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, all the typical stuff that gets said, right, like men, we're physically a little stronger, things like that. We're supposed to do physical stuff, right? Anyway, so Joe Rogan emphasizes the importance of physicality, which seems like such, again, a very simple solution to apparently a very deep problem. But I think it is a very deep solution, because in our modern living today, online through, digital means, digitality writ large, so much of what we do is so cerebral, right? And we forget all too often that we're not just these kind of disembodied, like we're not just kind of these brains floating in a vat, right? We are fundamentally, one of the reasons, again, I mean, I've mentioned this elsewhere, but one of the reasons why I like to do these podcasts standing on this wobble board, that's why I'm kind of wobbling from side to side occasionally, is because I have a very different experience energetically and so forth, as far as my presence and so on, standing as compared to if I was sitting down, with, in other words, very much physical beings. And the difference, as it were, between men and women Whereas women, in my understanding, my research, women are almost naturally in tune with, you guys are almost naturally in tune with your bodies, much more so than men, just by virtue of the fact that you have monthly cycles, right, after you hit puberty until, say in your 40s or whenever it is that that you stop having periods. But you're much more in tune with your bodies off the bat, whereas men, we really have to work at being in touch with our bodies, which is why working out is so important, why yoga is also really important. Yoga, I mean, historically wasn't what yoga is seen as being nowadays. It's something that very often middle class white women do. I mean, that's like the stereotypes. It's historically actually men did yoga in India, right? And there was actually historically, not wholly, but there was certainly a martial strain to it as well. It was used in sort of a lot of the yogis engaged in sort of combat and things like that. So that's why some of these poses, there's like warrior pose and all this like kind of military martial type language. So the point being, it's so important to be in touch with our bodies, and that is also part and parcel of kind of dropping into our core or cores, right, and becoming more expressive of all the inequalities that we have. Like, it's not accidental to my mind that all the major religious traditions, right, whether it's Islam, whether it's Eastern Christianity, historically Western Christianity is slightly different, but Hinduism, broadly speaking, right, Buddhism, etc., they all have very active physical practices as part and parcel of their kind of religious technologies, right? Because there's a deep awareness that we are nothing if not embodied beings. And how this relates to masculinity is, I think, when men are told that all we need do is just work this kind of organ, well, it's this organ and this organ down here, right? Like the penis. Like those are the two organs. Those
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I wasn't sure. I did wonder if it's talking about like feet or what is it? But so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, okay, fine. But you were looking. That's right. But because
I was listening.
That's true. But you know what I mean? Like, we've been reduced to, okay, we do our work online, sitting for endless hours, whatever, crouched over in front of the laptop, and then at the end of the day, we may be, I mean, this is a huge generalization and stereotyping, but I think it's sometimes generalizations and stereotypes have some.
I actually think you have there's a really valid point to what you're saying. And I think it's often
I was going to say, and at the end of the day, you kind of jerk off to porn, but sorry.
Well, at least you get some exercise, even if it's just
get some exercise. Right, that's the extent of the exercise. It's all for a good cause, yeah.
But that idea of being static for large periods of time is really damaging. We build up toxins within our body as the day goes on, and when we're sitting stationary, we're not getting rid of that. It's not going anywhere. So like you were saying, obviously, that you find this something that's especially important to men, and I would agree to an extent, but I think only because I watched this Kevin Hart show the other night, and in it, Kevin Hart said women don't know how to sit and do nothing. Like, they're always on the go. But that's not me. Just going back to the traditional guy, I am really good at doing nothing. Like, I am. If that was some sort of, I don't know, if there was a PhD in doing fuck all, I would get it. Like, I would be an expert in that field.
I don't think that's true. I mean, knowing you a little bit at this point, I know that you're a thinker. So which is one of the.
I can sit down and think all day long.
I know. So in some ways, you're kind of, you're masculine, as it were, in that way. It's stereotypically, and these kind of in archetypal terms.
Well, you know what? This is another thing, actually, right? So, sorry, just to go on with to kind of cement the last point there. Yes, we build up a lot of toxins in our bodies. Yes, it leads to potential mobility issues, back pain. So there's physical issues that can arise from just being static and having a static existence, which, as you know, things can progress more and more. We're spent more and more time online, particularly whenever it comes to these periods of lockdowns, these different lockdowns. You get an hour's exercise per day, which was what it was in the UK and the north of Ireland. Don't know what else it was like everywhere else, but you're kind of limited to your outside freedoms, and that's going to have an impact upon you. Then you've got the cold weather coming in, particularly where we live. You're England, I'm over here. Although I think, you're south of England, you guys have like French weather. So you're kind of a bit more housebound anyway, because then you don't go out as much. But anyway, yes, there are a lot of physiological and physical difficulties that arise or impacts from having a static existence or a majority static existence. And I do wonder if they play, an overall larger role in the impact upon emotional health and well-being. You get more and more people sitting at desks, get more and more people working longer hours, you get more and more people working at home. Also, when you're at home, you're 9 times out of 10, I mean, you're not sitting in the right kind of ways. Your posture's all wrong, your chair's all wrong, it's not the one that your office gives you, your desk isn't positioned properly, you're not looking at your lighting, you're just turning your laptop on and getting on with it, So there's all those risks that go with it too. But there was something you'd said there, and I meant to come back to it, but I have totally lost it now, my chain of thought, which is really annoying. I hate whenever that happens.
It's okay.
It was such a good point too. Do you ever get that? You're
like, oh, God, I believe you. No, it does. It does happen. But I mean, if that point comes back to you, please.
It has. The point has come back.
please.
Point has come back. Also on the subject of physiological and psychological benefits, we talked earlier on about humor and laughter and joy. And there are benefits associated with those as well, both from psychological and physiological viewpoints. It has an impact upon your heart rate. It has, there's the whole the hormones released in your brain, all of this here, so but we don't talk about these things enough. And I think part of the reason is as well, it's not even that we don't necessarily talk about them enough. I think a lot of people don't know. I think that we don't share the information enough. It's almost like, I'm not sure why that is. It's pretty simple to say to people here, 5 minutes laughter or whatever can, it benefits you for hours afterwards. I mean, that's astounding. More people should be watching comedy, but instead what we're trying to do is cancel a shitload of people instead, Don't know what that's about, but, so there's benefits to very simple things there. Don't sit down as much and laugh. And if people kind of incorporated those two simple aspects into their everyday life, you're going to feel a difference. And it's very simple.
Natalia, we're going to wrap up shortly. It's been really, really amazing, as always, talking to you. I think that's a really powerful point to maybe wrap up on. Don't sit in one place, and laugh more and communicate, connect.
And don't wait until people die before you tell them how much they mean to you.
I was just going to say, don't wait until people die before, telling them how much they mean to you and how they've touched you. And
try and appreciate a person's backstory whenever you're trying to understand why their love language, or how they are with their emotional awareness and expression. So
Beautiful. You're really brilliant, Natalia. Genuinely, I really appreciate all the insights, and let's do more of these, more with greater frequency than than we've done thus far.
then like the 2 months break that took.
Yeah, that was a bit too long for my liking, because these are very, very important discussions, and we touched upon, and you brought up some very, very important points throughout, vitally important, and I hope people will listen to your insights and benefit from them, because they're very profound and very wise insights, genuinely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia McMahon.
Thank you. See you later. Bye.
Talk